Every Space Marine on the Indomitus Crusade is proud of the armour they wear into battle. In this video we're going to show you exactly how to take your noble Ultramarines from Battle Ready Standard up to Parade Ready Standard, using layers and highlights, tips and techniques to really make your miniatures stand out on the battlefield. So grab your paints and your brushes and let's do this. So let's get painting. Now you'll notice our Assault Intercessor Sergeant here has already been painted up to Battle Ready Standard and he's been based as well. If you want to know how to prepare your model by doing those two things, go and check out the Indomitus Battle Ready Ultramarines and the Indomitus Basing videos, both now available on Warhammer TV. So let's get on with that Ultramarine. And of course the first I'm going to highlight up is our famous blue armour. It's already been base coated and washed in the Battle Ready video, and now we're going to highlight it up with Calgar blue and then Fenrisian grey over the top of that. For both of these highlights, we're going to be using our small layer brush, and here's how. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot first of all and add it to our palette like so. Now for a highlight on a Space Marine, we're going to add quite a bit of water here to thin it down to make it nice and subtle when it goes on. We're also going to make sure we've got a nice point on the brush, so we're going to rifle our brush back a little bit like so, just to make sure there's a nice point on the brush. Perfect. Then, onto our miniature. Here, we're very carefully going to be painting the highlights onto the edges of all the blue armour, so very carefully apply it, maybe even hold your breath as it goes on. Apply it around the edge of the armour like so. Now this is going to be a very time-consuming process, as there's lots of edges on a Space Marine, but don't worry, it's absolutely worth your time doing this. Do this around the entire model on all the blue edges, and once that's done, we'll move on to the next stage. So there we go, the Calgar blue highlight's been applied all over our Marine, but look, on this knee pad here, we've made a bit of a mistake. That highlight's a bit too thick there. So here's how we're going to correct our mistakes, should you do that when you're highlighting Space Marines, which happens quite a lot. So we're going to go back with the original Macragge blue base coat paint and cut into that highlight to make it the thickness we want it to be. And here's how we're going to do it. Take a little bit of Macragge blue from the pot here, and it's to our palette like so. Just a touch of water now, just to thin it down a little bit. Then onto our Space Marine, very carefully, we're going to just cut back into this highlight here, like so, just to make it as thick as we want it to be. So we're just going to thin that highlight down, like so, very carefully, cutting back in, like so. Up next, we're applying a very fine highlight of Fenrisian grey to the very edges of the armour. Here we're applying it to just the edge, so we're leaving just a little bit of the Calgar blue showing through on the inside. Again, be as fine as you possibly can with this. Try not to make any mistakes. If you do, you can always go back and correct it later on with the original colours. So there we go. With that, the blue armour of our Ultramarine is fully highlighted. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the metallics on our Space Marine. We'll start off by highlighting the gold Liberator Gold. Then we'll highlight the silver with Iron Hand Steel, and finally we'll use Stormhost Silver to highlight both areas. For all of this, again, we're using our small layer brush. So first we'll start off with the Liberator Gold, and here we're going to be adding a little bit to our palette here, just make sure we're not overloading the brush. We're not going to add any water here because the Liberator Gold's already quite a thin paint and we don't want to water down our metallics. So there we go, that's enough on the brush. Then onto our miniature. Here we're very carefully highlighting the golden areas. Again, we're adding to the edges of the plates here, so down the edges of the shoulder pad rim here, and also onto the tips of the Aquila on the chest as well. Next up, we're highlighting the silver parts of the miniature with Iron Hand Steel. Again, we're using a small layer brush here, and just highlighting the edges of the metal parts. And last but not least, on the metallic areas, we're going to give a very fine highlight of Stormhost Silver to both the gold and the silver. So here it's applying it to the very edges of the metallics like this. On large ridged areas such as this one sticking out from the miniature, you can use the edge of the brush like this to get a really easy fine highlight around the miniature. So there we go, with the gold and silver highlighted with Stormhost Silver, that's the metallic areas of our Space Marine complete. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the black areas of our Space Marine. This is going to be the joints in between the armour panels, the casing on the gun, the casing on the sword, and also if you're painting any black armoured Space Marines like a Judiseer or a Primaris Chaplain, the armour for those too. Now again, we've already base coated them and shaded them recently in the Battle Ready video, and first of all we're going to start off with a highlight of Eshin Grey. Over the top of that we'll highlight with Dawnstone, and for these, again both, we're going to be using our small layer brush. So let's take a little bit of Eshin Grey from the pot like so and onto our palette. Again, a touch of water here to thin it down, and a little bit more, there we go, perfect. Again, we've got a nice thin tip on the brush here for highlights. Then onto our Space Marine. Here we're going to be very carefully applying the Eshin Grey highlights along the edges of the black areas here. So we're looking at the casing on his bolt pistol here, Also, we're looking at the casing on the sword. We're going along the edges here as well. And don't forget to highlight those joints in between the armour panels too. Over the top of that, we're applying a highlight of Dawnstone. Again, we're using a small layer brush here, and we've thinned our paint down with a touch of water to help it go on nice and smooth. Very, very carefully, just highlight the very, very edges with Dawnstone in this way. And once that's done, we'll move on to the next stage. And there we go. With that, the black areas of our Space Marine are painted. All right, up next, let's have a look at the white areas of our Marine. This is going to be the white armour on his tilting plate, but this technique also works for the helmet and shields of your Blade Guard veterans too. First of all, a highlight of Korax White will go down, and after that, a thin highlight of White Scar over the top. Again, for both of these, we'll be using our small layer brush. Again, let's take a little bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette like this. A little bit of water here, just to thin it down a touch. Make sure our brush is nice and smooth and thin as well. There we go, that's pretty much perfect. Then onto our Space Marine. Here we're very carefully just highlighting the tilting plate. Again, just using the edges of the tilting plate like so. Very, very carefully, just touching the edges like that. Use the edge of the brush here around the side. You get a nice thin highlight going down the edge like this. Then over the top of this, a very fine highlight of White Scar just on the very edges. Again, just using the edge of the brush like so, just to make sure we're only picking out the absolute very sharp edges of this white armour. And there we go. Alright, up next let's have a look at the red armour of our Space Marines. This of course will be the helmet of our Assault Intercessor Sergeant and also his tilting plate as well. We've already base coated it and shaded it, and now we're going to highlight it with Wild Rider Red, and after that a thin highlight of Fire Dragon Bright. Again, both of these are using our small layer brush. First of all, that Wild Rider Red. Let's take a little bit of paint from the pot here. Now here we want it to be quite subtle on the miniature, so I'm going to be thinning it down quite a bit with water, just make sure it's not too strong a colour when it's applied. There we go, that's pretty much perfect. Bit more water I reckon. There we go. Perfect. Then onto our Space Marine miniature. Again, as before, we're applying very careful edge highlights along the edges of our plate armour. So on the helmet here, along the ridge like so, and on all the sharp edges of the helmet. Next up on the red armour, we're going to be applying a very thin highlight of Fire Dragon Bright just to the very, very, very edges, like this. There we go, that's the red armour done. Now we're going to move on to the brown leather on our miniature. So that's the pouches, the Space Marine's belt, and the grip of the chainsword. For this, we're going to be highlighting with Mournfang Brown, followed by a highlight of XV88. And again, for both of these, we're using our small layer brush. For the Mournfang Brown, let's take a little bit of paint out of the pot, and again, add a little bit of water here to thin it down to really help it go onto the model nice and subtly and smoothly. Also get a nice point on that brush. Perfect. Then, onto our Space Marine. We're looking at the pouch at the back here. It's going to be very carefully highlighting the edges of the pouches and the belt, that sort of thing. Now, because Mournfang Brown was originally used as the base coat, this will be a nice subtle highlight. That's absolutely perfect. So it'll be nice subtle blends going into the edges of the pouches, the belt, and the grip of the chainsword. Next, over the top of this, we're going over it with a thin line of XV88 to highlight it. XV88 is a base paint, so make sure you thin it down with quite a bit of water to make it go on really smoothly. And there we go, that's the leather on our Space Marine complete. Okay, so let's have a look at painting the green lenses and glowing glass on our Space Marine. This will be the glass on his control panel on his arm, and also the lenses on his helmet too. First of all, we've already base coated them, washing them in the previous video, and now we're going to be layering up with a layer of Warpstone Glow, and over the top of that, a highlight of Moot Green. First of all, that Warpstone Glow. So here we're going to be taking a bit of paint from the pot and adding it to our palette here. A touch of water here. Now, we want it to be quite a subtle colour again, so adding quite a little bit of water here. There we go, that should be absolutely perfect. Then, onto our Space Marine miniature. Here, on the arm, you see a little control panel on his arm there. We're just going to be painting that very carefully. And we're going to be concentrating the green here up towards one corner. So I'm going to concentrate on this top corner here, just painting it around like so, and leaving the bottom corner the original colour underneath. Same on the eyes. We're going to be painting the eyes in here as well. Breathe in here, nice and delicate detail. Just going to be painting that towards the front of the eyes, leaving the back of the eyes the original colour. And next up on the green lenses, we're just going to be adding a little bit of Moot Green. Again, we thinned it down quite a lot, so applying it to the very, very corner and the very, very edge of the glass control panel here, and on the eyes to the very, very front, like so. There we go, that's the lenses done. Now, if your Space Marine has a blue helmet, simply use Mephiston red and Troll Slayer orange in the same way. So let's have a look now at some more models from the Indomitus box. And up next is the Outrider Sergeant. For this we're going to be looking at the light flesh on his head and the dark metal on the exhaust port of his bike. First of all, that light flesh. And we're going to start with a layer of Kislev flesh. We're going to thin down that quite a bit. Over the top of that, we're going to be using a highlight of Flayed flesh. First of all, that layer of Kislev flesh. And for this, we're using our small layer brush. So let's take a little bit of paint from the pot like so and onto our palette like this. We want this to be quite a subtle effect on the top of the head here, so I'm going to thin this down quite a bit, make sure it's not overbearing on the miniature. There we go, add a bit more water, maybe a bit more. There we go, perfect. Then onto the miniature, we're going to paint it very carefully onto our sergeant's head. So very carefully now, just painting over the top of the head here. We're going to be leaving the deeper recesses, the colour we've already painted before, but just going to be going over the higher areas now with this Kislev flesh. A nice light thin coat to get a nice smooth effect on his head. And next up, again we use a small layer brush to add thin down Flayed flesh to the very ridges and highest parts of the face. So there we go, that's the face painted. And you can also see we've picked out the service studs on his forehead there with a dot of iron hand steel. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the dark metal on the exhaust ports on his bike. This is also the same way we're painting the dark metal on the Eradicator's melter gun's muzzles. First of all, we'll start with a highlight of Brass Scorpion, and over the top of that, a highlight of Sycorax Bronze. For both of these, we're going to be using our small layer brush. So let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette here. Now we're going to add a little bit of water here for this Brass Scorpion highlight, not too much for a metallic paint, but just a little bit, maybe a bit more. There we go, that's perfect. Then, onto the bike. We're going to very carefully be painting the sharp highlights here on the ports on the exhaust at the back here. So just bringing it down along all the straight edges, both along the edges and also on the insides here on these open vents as well. Next, over the top of this, we're adding a sharp highlight of Sycorax Bronze on the very, very sharpest edges of these bike exhaust ports here. So here we're using the edge of the brush like so, just to make sure only the very, very edges are picked out. There we go, that's the metal done and our Outrider Sergeant complete. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the dark flesh on our Eradicator Sergeant. Now we've already applied a Cygor brown contrast over a Wraithbone paint in the Battle Ready video, and now I'm going to apply a layer of Catachan flesh over the top, followed by a highlight of Blood Reaver flesh. For both of these we're going to be using our small layer brush. So first of all, let's take a little bit of Catachan flesh from the pot like so, and onto our palette here. Now again, we want it to be quite a subtle coat, so we're going to be thinning it down quite a bit, to make sure it goes on quite lightly. A bit more, there we go, that's perfect. Then, onto our Eradicator Sergeant. We're very carefully going to be painting it on a light layer over the top of the Cygor brown we painted earlier on. Here, we want to be making sure we're leaving the darker recesses the original colour. We're just painting the higher areas here, so the top of the head and the ridges and things on his face as well. And next up, we're going to thin down some Blood Reaver flesh and very carefully pick out the ridges and the higher parts of the face. There we go, that's the flesh on our Sergeant complete. We've also been back to pick up those service studs with a pot of iron hand steel. Alright, let's move on next to the Primaris Captain, and here we have a couple of areas to cover. We'll start off by painting the tabard and the purity seals, then we'll look at the purity seal wax, before moving on to the big skeleton hanging off his shield, and then finally the power sword in his hand as well. First of all, we're going to paint the cloth of both the tabard and the purity seals in the same way. We'll start with a layer of Carrick stone, moving on to a highlight of a Shabti bone afterwards. Then we'll pick out that purity seal wax with a highlight of pink horror. First of all, time for that layer of Carrick stone, and for this we're using our medium layer brush. So let's take a bit of paint from the pot here and onto our palette. Now here we're going to add a little bit of water just to thin it down, as we want this to be a nice subtle thin layer going on over the top of what we've already done. Bit more water perhaps? There we go, perfect. I'm also going to make sure I've got a nice, straight, thin brush to paint with. Then, onto the miniature. Here we're painting very carefully onto our miniature's tabard and the purity seal as well. So here we're very carefully picking out the raised areas, like so. Being very careful to make sure we're leaving the lower areas, the recesses, the original colour we've already painted. Just go around the tabard here. This will be a nice, subtle highlight. But don't worry, that's absolutely intended to make a nice, good blend between the colours we've already painted and the ones we're going to paint next. Next up, we've gone back to our small layer brush and we're adding a thin down highlight of a Shabti bone onto the very, very highest areas of our tabard and purity seal. So it's onto the ridges like this and also onto the edges of the purity seal cloth as well. Next up, let's use some pink horror, again with a small layer brush here, just to pick out the very edges of the purity seal wax. That's the circular bits at the top of all the purity seals, like so. It's a nice thin line around the edge like so, and a dot in the centre. And there we go. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting that giant skeleton on the front of our captain's shield. Now first of all, we're going to be giving it a layer of Morghast bone, and over the top of that a highlight of Ushabti bone. First of all, that layer of Morghast bone, and for this we're using our small layer brush. So let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and again onto the palette, again thinning it down here, as we want this to be a nice thin layer on the miniature, not too thick. There we go, that's pretty much perfect. Then, onto our captain. Here on the shield, we're going to be very carefully painting a layer over the top of the skeleton here. We're just picking out the higher parts of the bone on the skeleton, leaving the deeper recesses and the area near to deeper recesses, such as this here, the colour it already was. So just very carefully painting that layer over the top, like so. Take your time on this, as it's such a central part of the miniature and such a focal point. You want to make sure it's as neat as you possibly can be. Up next, take a small layer brush and some thin down Ushabti bone. Very carefully pick out the raised areas of the bone only. So just around the edges of the bones like this, just picking out the highlighted bits just to really bring that bone out. And there we go, that's the highlight done on the bone. We've also been back and picked out that chain around the skeleton's hand and also the service stud on his head by first painting it a bad and black and then picking it out with iron hand steel. Alright, up next have a look at the power sword in our captain's hand. I'm going to give two very simple highlights here. First of all, a subtle highlight with iron hand steel, and then a sharper highlight with Stormhost silver. For both of these we're going to be using our small layer brush. So first of all, that iron hand steel. Let's take a little bit of paint from the pot like so, and as always, a little bit of water. Now, we're using a metallic paint here, so not too much water, just a little bit, maybe a bit more. There we go, we want it to be a nice subtle highlight again. So onto our miniature. Here, we're painting the power sword. Now, we're just going to be very carefully using the edge of the brush and dragging this paint down the edge of the blade like so. You can see it's just very, very subtly picking out the edges like that. Do this all the way around the power sword. We're also going to be doing just the central spike as well in the middle of the sword, just very carefully with the tip of the brush, bringing this down in the centre like so. Then next up, we're adding a thin down highlight of Stormhost silver. Again, we're going to use the edge of the brush here just to drag it down the blade like so, picking out just the very, very edge of our power sword. We'll also use this to pick out the power node here as well. So little highlights here too. And there we go, that's our Primaris Captain done. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the Judiciar. There's a couple of areas we want to look at here. First of all, the brown robes he's wearing, and then second of all, the skull helmet and the light bone around his waist as well. So first of all, let's have a look at those brown robes. And for this, we're going to be starting off with a layer of Rhinox hide, and over the top of that, a highlight of Steel Legion drab. First of all, let's have a look at that layer of Rhinox hide, and for this we're using our small layer brush. Again, let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette. Now here we're going to add quite a bit of water. We want this to be a really subtle layer, nice and blended in to the previous one we've done, so quite a bit of water. There we go, absolutely perfect. Bingo. Then, onto our Judiciar. Let's paint these brown robes in here. So here we're very carefully picking out the raised areas of the robes, like so, leaving the recessed areas the colour it already was. Now, seeing as we're painting over the top of Rhinox hide and a wash already, this will be a really, really subtle layer, but that's absolutely perfect. It'll blend up nicely for the highlight we're going to apply later on. Next up, we've taken some really thin down Steel Legion drab. I'm just applying it very carefully as a highlight all over our brown robe. Here, looking for it to be nice and sharp on the very, very edges. So keep that highlight nice and sharp using a small layer brush. There we go, with that highlight done, that's the robes complete. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the light bone on his helmet and also the ribs around his chest as well. For this we'll start with a layer of wraith bone, and over the top of that a highlight of white scar. For both of these again we're using our small layer brush. So first of all, let's go for that wraith bone. Again, we want it to be a nice subtle highlight, so we're going to thin it down with quite a bit of water, about 50-50. There we go, that's bang on. Next up, on our Judiciar. Very carefully we're going to paint it onto the helmet here. Now here we're making sure we're leaving the recessed areas, that darker wash we did earlier on. So it's going to paint the higher areas like so, and the cranial ridge, and go along the top of the helmet like this. Then also on those ribs on his chest, let's pick out those ribs too, leaving the recessed areas the original colour. Then after that, we're applying a very fine highlight of white scar just at the very, very ridges on that helmet here. So the highest points just applying it back like this. So there we go, that's the helmet done. We've also been back and dotted the studs on top there with iron hand steel. Alright, so that's how you can paint your Ultramarines up to parade ready standard. A couple of things to remember here. First of all, when applying layer paints, always water them down so they go on a lot more smoothly, as that thin paint will mean a nice blended transition between colours. Second of all, when applying those layer paints, make sure leaving the recesses free when you're putting the first layer down. Then the second highlight goes on a lot thinner inside that first highlight. That way you get that really cool blended highlighted effect between colours. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Happy painting!